Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new album from tUnE-yArDs, titled Nikki Nack. But first, let's talk about cultural appropriation. Now, wait a minute, before everyone jumps down my throat, I think actually defining this term in reference to music might actually be helpful. So here it goes. Cultural appropriation means the usage of specific musical elements that can be directly linked to another culture without proper knowledge of their execution or without reasoned intent. In other words, if you're gonna borrow from other cultures, know what the hell you're doing and do it well. Because believe it or not, I'm not inherently against the embrace of material from other cultures. As to strictly confine themselves to one's own narrowly defined culture, that can limit musical expression and it shuts down the artistic conversation about integrating and blending ideals and expressions from everybody, which can only be a good thing. That said, what people tend not to like with cultural appropriation is when the artist uses it to add connotations of exoticism or tribalism, or in the very worst cases, denigrating or incorrect stereotypes associated in the Western collective unconscious with that sound. It's one of the issues that I had with, say, Vampire Weekend's usage of African elements. Sure, I'll admit it fits the modern multicultural atmosphere that the band has always striven to create, but the underlying defensiveness regarding privilege in a lot of their music has made their usage of some of those African elements a little bit uncomfortable for me, which is really frustrating because otherwise, I really like Vampire Weekend and I really like their music. This also became an issue with Arcade Fire's most recent album, Reflector, an album that utilized some Haitian elements in order to enhance their inspiration from Black Orpheus, but then they overloaded their stage show and revealed in their songwriting a serious misunderstanding of those Haitian elements, and they really started to skirt those lines. And yet, when I took a look at tUnE-yArDs' 2011 album, Who Kill, I was pleasantly surprised to see that my fears of cultural appropriation were mostly unfounded, as lead performer Merrill Garbus seemed to be at least aware of the roots of her material and was trying her absolute best to recreate that particular brand of pop, and was, for the most part, thanks to her soulful and bold delivery, really succeeding quite well. She reminded me on a deeper listen a lot of MIA, especially in the patchy, lo-fi production, colorful sound collage approach, and a complete lack of subtlety. But say what you will about MIA, at least her first two albums approached the subject matter with something of a cohesive tone. By contrast, Who Kill by tUnE-yArDs was perhaps the most placid and buoyant album describing violent subject matter that I've ever heard. And despite some harsh-leaning lyrics and a rich organic sound, it lacked real organic depth and deeper insight, at least for me, and it wasn't nearly raw enough to connect with me on much of a visceral level either. In other words, as much as I liked the bass melodies and the textured percussion, I felt the album lacked the real punch to really belly some of its subject matter. So thus, I was kinda curious what was in store for the next album, Nikki Nack, which looked to be heading in a different direction, at least to some degree instrumentally. How did that turn out? Well, it's a better album than Who Kill, I can say that, and I do appreciate more of what tUnE-yArDs is trying to do with this album. That said, while I can recognize quality, it's also a record that I can just say, mostly, it's not for me. I'm not saying that it doesn't execute its purpose or doesn't deliver interesting or cohesive music, but you know what? I know my taste, and I can say that Nikki Nack isn't really a record I can see myself revisiting much further. That doesn't mean it's bad, it just means it's not for me. And also doesn't mean I'm not going to recommend this album, because I am. But it plays to a different sound palette than one that I normally like. And acknowledgement of that fact, while still recognizing this album's strengths and weaknesses, is to me its appropriate step. So I can say that it's not for me, and yet still come here and recommend it for you all. So okay, let's start with Merrill Garbus herself, who is, in my opinion, the biggest reason why anyone should listen to tUnE-yArDs, because she is a great presence behind the microphone. Not only stepping up with an impressive, expressive range, but effortlessly harmonizing with her backing vocals time and time again to pretty much carry the entire underlying melody of this record. Her voice really reminds me a lot of Lou Watts, formerly of the anarcho-punk band Chumbawamba, one of my favorite bands of all time. And you know what, frankly, I'd argue Garbus has an even better sound and emotional presence than Watts ever did. And while I'll admit my personal preference lies in some of the more melodic singing, the fact that Garbus can contort her voice into all manner of of shouts and barbaric yelps does add a lot of variety. I can admit that. In fact, variety is practically the name of the game on Nikki Nack as it was on Who Kill, because once again we get another cacophonous sound collage of vocals, well-textured and eclectic percussion, the subtle thrum of Nate Brenner's bass, and most notably on this record, a selection of synths that vary from cheap mid-80s Casio lines to fuzzy chiptune. In that element, tUnE-yArDs maintains the scrappy, piecemeal sound that they always had, but it feels slightly better mixed on this album, which I can appreciate, especially in the slower tracks that opt to give the bass a little bit more presence, to give the songs just a little bit more room to really breathe. And while I can say that not all the synth choices work for me, the chiptune ones in particular, they really don't feel completely cohesive with the percussion, they do complement the melodies fairly well, especially when they add some of the thicker grime to songs like Stop That Man and Man-Child, which can cut back on some of the brazen cuteness of the performance that appears all over this album in the nursery rhyme cadences and the melodic progressions. But my issues with tUnE-yArDs have always been in lyrics and themes. So what is Garbus looking to talk about here? Well, honestly, it's a little bit more disjointed than it was on Who Kill, but the focus is still plainly generally agreeable anti-consumerism, women's rights, and finding a way to stick together even as the world might crumble around us. Indeed, that sense of overall togetherness, it's a very big running motif of this album. And my personal favorite track of this record is Wait for a Minute, a song where Garbus is fighting against her own insecurities and loneliness, showing some real vulnerability that really does deepen this record and add a certain amount of soul to it. Outside of that, the songs that she addresses some women's issues and Stop That Man and Man-Child do show some pretty impressive, if rather bluntly presented, nuance. And while it's nothing all that revolutionary, in today's day and age it's still welcome to hear. However, I'm not the biggest fan of her anti-consumerism tracks. While there is real nuance in songs like Water Fountain and Left Behind and the satirical spoken word piece, Why Do We Dine on the Tots, they do feel a little broadly sketched and show traces of that tonal inconsistency that really peppered Who Kill. And while I do mostly agree with the sentiments, they just didn't quite click with me, if that makes any sense. And just to visit that topic of cultural appropriation, let's talk about this for a minute, because I was both surprised and a little anxious when I saw Garbus tackling it directly head on in Real Thing, where she seems very much aware of the fact that she's not the right person to utilize this sort of aesthetic that she uses throughout her album, and seems thus determined to viscerally point out the blatant hypocrisy in not stopping her. Now, I do respect the intent of this, and the execution is solid on this track, but at the same time, there are points where it gets to be a little questionable. Take the lyric on Cinco, a song about the collapse of society and how some will choose to fend for themselves above helping others and they'll ultimately suffer for it. And then you get the lyric, if I went up to your door, you wouldn't let me in. So don't say you don't judge others by the color of their skin. Okay. Or take the lyrics in Left Behind. We said we never let them take our soil. Look, okay, I get the sentiment behind these lyrics, but I have to say this. There were better ways of sympathizing with the plight of Native Americans than phrasing the lyric quite like that. It doesn't come across as entirely flattering there. But you know what? All in all, there are pieces of this album that I do genuinely like. The slower moments in particular. It's certainly a unique album, that's for sure. You're not going to hear a record like tUnE-yArDs' Nikki Nack anytime soon this year. But at the same time, some of the garish, clattering, shouty moments of this album really do grate on my patience and really get kind of annoying. It reminds me of that friend you all inevitably meet or make that friend in college. The one who always seems to run on limitless energy, pursuing a dozen or more different social justice causes with all sorts of passion and fervor. And while you can admire her energy and even be sucked into it on occasion, it definitely gets tiresome to be around that friend for too long. And you know what? That's how I kind of feel about this album. So with the acknowledgement that this album really isn't quite all there for me, I'm giving it a 7 out of 10 and a recommendation. Social justice albums are rarely this simultaneously eclectic and cohesive. So on that note alone, Nikki Nack by tUnE-yArDs, definitely worth a look. So check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums coming up that you'd like me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. So until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.